And we are live.
Okay. Hi, I'm Steve Stirling. I publish under SM Stirling. Today I'm going to be reading from Daggers in Darkness, which is the beginning of a new trilogy in my Black Chamber alternate history. I think I'll just pop right in because the prologue, which I'm going to be reading, is intended to reintroduce the series. So I start with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, who's a backstage character in this series. "The best leader is one who has good sense enough to pick the right people to do what he wants done, and self-restraint enough to keep from meddling with them while they do it." Theodore Roosevelt. Prologue. Aboard presidential airship Rough Rider, presidential air yacht, Airship 1, approaching San Diego, California, September 26, 1922 AD, 1922 B. Point of departure plus 10 years. Theodore Roosevelt never liked administrative work, but he was very good at it, and it was still entrancing to do it here in the glassed-in front section of the main deck of the Rough Rider, which he designated as his office when American National Airways designed this great craft for him and delivered it just in time for the final month of touring before the 1920 election, which did graphically to every eye that saw how America leads the world in aviation under the new nationalism, he thought. And I admit it, I always did like playing with a new toy. He was head of the PRP, the Progressive Republican Party, and president of a progressive America striding confidently into the future. It was only fitting that he should have a means of travel by air. He'd intended a career in the sciences as a youngster, before Paula claimed him, and followed them closely all his life. He'd been the first American president to fly, and the first to drive an auto, the first to really understand the changes the modern world was bringing to every aspect of war and industry and everyday life. The 750 feet of the Rough Rider were clad in shining aluminum alloy sheets over its simplified internal skeleton rather than doped fabric, a novelty that made it lighter and stronger and absolutely fireproof as well. No more storing flammable hydrogen and flammable containers, and nowadays I can even broadcast my voice from here into the homes of the people. There are more and more radio receivers in American homes every month. In a few years, nearly everyone will have one. And here he could stand with the horseshoe shape of glass around him. Once you were used to the muted drone of the engines, less noise than an automobile, it was impressively quiet, quieter even than the creak of a wooden sailing skiff. Like standing on a magic carpet from a children's tale, he thought. Standing there while the airship sailed cloud canyons blinding white or dark and laced with blue lightning, or shadowed and lit by the moon. Or while a storm lashed rain and hail against the panes, or while the great craft threaded mountain chasms that reduced it and him to an insignificance that was as profound as sleeping beneath sequoias and reminded him of the frozen infinity of the winter plains in the Dakotas. And the views, he thought. He turned his swivel chair to look out the semicircle of inward slanting 18-foot windows that folded around the big U-shaped room, while his new confidential secretary, she was a Miss Frances Perkins, just transferred from the Department of Education to the Executive Service in the White House and highly recommended, caught up with the series of memos he was dictating. How marvelous, he thought. It gives me a new way to see this vast country of ours, like a map, but alive, alive. They were on the approach to San Diego now, on a brilliant fall afternoon. From 1,200 feet, he could see the brown and sage-green hills ending against the white-blue line of the sea, the lush garden spots around Balboa Park, and ribbons of green between the mesas, and the long, narrow harbor, and the Navy squadron that was the ostensible, and to himself almost also enjoyable, reason for his visit here. More new toys, he thought wryly. If you don't have at least a smidgen of self-knowledge at 64, you are never going to get any. The 6 battleships in the airplane carrier and their attendant cruisers, destroyers, oilers, and support ships sat below him in the great new naval docks, all about to depart for Manila and the front line of the Oceanian Alliance's uneasy peace against, you might say, a cold peace, the vastly enlarged realm of Dainapan. The airplane carrier USS Ulysses Grant was new, of course, radical and alien with the eye-catching oddness of the stark, bare 900-foot by 150 rectangle of its flight deck and the offset island superstructure and stacks, Though right now the space was crowded with the full complement of dive bombers and torpedo bombers and the latest Curtiss Puma Mark VI fighting scouts, 100 airplanes on deck for the ceremony. 2 of the battleships were also just through their shakedown cruises, and they were the most powerful naval units in the world. Colorado class, the ship herself and the Alberta, named for one of the new states he brought into the sheltering arms of the Union when London was destroyed by the German V-gas. Giant, swift, sleek predators of the waves. 60,000 tons, 30 knots, oil-fired turbo-electric drive, anti-torpedo bulges, and the new bulb-bowed Taylor hull formed below the waterline. 12 16-inch guns in 4 massive turrets, and bristling with anti-airplane armament, and the antennae of telemobiloscopes that could probe the darkest night or the furthest sky out to the horizon and beyond. The armored fist of the Republic, raised against any threat, an eagle shield for my people, he thought. He'd attended their gunnery trials himself and pressed the fire key from the bridge, feeling a rush of pride, and, he admitted to himself, a bit of a 10-year-old boy's sheer delight in making an enormous world-shaking noise as a dozen massive shells slammed out into the distance, and the vast ship heeled under the hammer blows of recoil. And there was the Devastator. Officially, in the antiseptic terminology of military bureaucracy, she was a bombardment monitor. He scowled a moment at the sight, hating the necessity for her and her sisters. She was about the same size as the airplane carrier, and even odder looking, with the funnel and bridge right at the stern, only a few token anti-airplane guns. The real weapons were on the scores of low-sloping ramps that pointed towards the bow, and stacked in the magazines below, the Lufttorpedos, sky torpedoes. Another German invention, brought in right at the end of the Great War, after Zeppelin bombers no longer stood a chance against fighting scout airplanes. They even looked like a torpedo, a bluntly pointed metal cylinder, though the shell was aluminum. With a propeller at the rear, too, though a bigger one than their watery kin. Fins and a single high wing and fuel tank were added to make them into the bastard offspring of a bird and a snake. A rocket bottle would kick them up the ramp to above stall speed, and the rear-mounted engine would keep them going, for the latest version out to around 250 miles in a bit over 2 hours. The gyroelectric principle of the guidance system had been invented by an American named Sperry before the war, but Germany had been first to put all the elements together. It would fly blindly through the air, through the night, to rain death on the target, or at least its general area. The wing knocked clear by explosive bolts when the engine fell silent, arcing down out of darkness. 1,000 pounds in the warhead, and the aptly named Devastator carried 1,000 of them. Special submarines bore smaller but still deadly numbers. With high explosive, they could devastate a large city in a single massive blow, like a blind sledgehammer from the sky, like hot steel rain. With 500 tons of V-gas on a large city, the deaths of millions, many millions. Annihilation. V-gas, he thought. Vernichtungsgas. Annihilation gas. Horror gas. The devil's instrument and the devil's own luck. Without it, we would have won the Great War, beaten Germany to powder by 1918 at the latest. With it, the world we have instead, stalemate. The world went on in the work of the day. It was his job to see it went well for America. He shook off the sudden flash of darkness. Instead, he swiveled back and spoke to young Miss Perkins, who drafted everything into formal language for him to look over before the final result was sent. It was still a little odd to see a woman in such a job, and with skirts fully 4 inches above the ankle, not even covering all the calves, and over legs sheathed in nothing but transparent silk. Still, he thought, if it's to be done, best do it right. After all, when the old guard turned the woman's suffrage amendment into an equal rights one in 1913, and thought that such committee trickery would kill it, and I'd back down, and everyone else, well, everyone else but Jane, wanted to, I insisted we fight it through, because it only said the same things I argued for in my senior thesis at Harvard back in, good Lord, 1880, 40 years and more. Next, Miss Perkins, to Senator Whitby of the Appropriations Committee. Senator, we have no alternative to urgently enlarging the Panama Canal. The whole point of the canal was to be able to shift our fleet from one coast to the other safely without going around Cape Horn, and the latest Navy ships are too large for the present one. Warship tonnages have increased much more rapidly than anticipated, and merchant ships are sure to follow. And this time we'll plan for future growth so we won't have to waste money and do it over again in another 5 or 6 years, you blithering, cheese-paring, penny-wise, dollar-foolish dolt. And if you don't shut up about it, you're going to learn just exactly why we put the recall provision for all federal judges and legislators in that amendment in 1913. Perkins' eyes bulged a little at that, and Roosevelt took pity on her. Youthful idealism was a precious resource, though the youngsters also needed to learn that politics was a rough game. Make that last part more diplomatic, Miss Perkins, but unmistakable. Whitby will fold, he thought coldly, with the experience of decades judging men. The senator might hanker in his heart after the old days when senior senators could be independent chieftains who must be courted and flattered, but his head knew better. Plus he knew the man, and speaking of his anatomy and the organs thereof, I could carve a better backbone than his out of a ripe banana, he thought. His mind ticked down a list. They'd always been able to read quickly, and remembered nearly all of it verbatim whenever he needed it, even years later. Next, to the chairman of the Association of Coal Mine Operators, use the usual formulas of greeting. Note that it's a reply to their latest protest about the Wage Board Arbitration Awards, and then just 3 words, nothing else: American National Railways. Back early in the century, Back early in the century, during his first administration, he'd cut his teeth settling a hard-fought strike in the anthracite mines, and it had formed his view of big business's political acumen, or lack thereof. His opinion of their morals had already been rather low. Nationalizing the railways had been done as an emergency measure in 1913 because the companies so thoroughly botched the job of moving troops during the first months of the Mexican intervention. Popular feeling had been running very high, and American National Railways had worked out much better than he feared. And it had given him a useful, horrid example ever since. The party's militants loved giant, smoothly organized operations and admired their administrators and engineers. But the big capitalists who owned the firms? Them, not nearly so much. The days when moguls like J.P. Morgan had casually assumed they could treat with the President of the United States as an equal were long gone. In point of fact, despite hints from the UMWA, he very much didn't want to nationalize the coal mines. I know civil servants too well to want it. But the mine owners don't know that, he thought. The coal magnate's own delusional fears of Red Ted would make them think he did, and be very anxious indeed not to provoke him. Next, to the Secretary of Education. Dear Jane, I completely agree the school lunch bill's time has come, long overdue in fact. It's a disgrace and a threat to the future of the United States and the American people that there are still school children, any school children, coming to lessons too hungry to learn well, not to mention building strong bodies and minds to serve America. And the evidence your people have dug up is incontrovertible. Bully. Have your staff draft the appropriate proposals and send them to me. If anyone tries to obstruct you, quote me as saying they'll be very unhappy indeed if they have to come and get it again from the horse's mouth. And, he thought, it'll help with the surplus crops problem Henry Wallace over at Agriculture is on about. Who would have thought it? Feeding hungry children good solid midday meals with meat and milk and vegetables and bread and butter and an apple or an orange or a peach is a solution to agricultural overproduction. No doubt some professor of economics can justify it ex post facto with graphs and equations. I recall Jesus having something to say on the subject as well. Another mental item to tick off, saving the most delicate for last. Next, to the Secretary of Agriculture. Dear Henry, I agree that the point of our land reform program in the South is to make the former sharecroppers and tenants into independent yeomen like your neighbors in Iowa, not government dependents. He thought hard before he went on. Henry Cantwell Wallace was a good party man and very able at implementing the crucially important country life program that was transforming daily existence for a third of the American people, but a little touchy about his modest roots and microscopic winterset, lost in the endless grid-divided green and gold rustle of the Midwestern Corn Belt. A place and people who are a fundamental pillar of our strength, yet so easy to forget from the vantage of the great cities. But in reaction, Henry tends to try and treat all rural areas as if they were Iowa, which they are not, or as if they could be the Iowa of his hopes and dreams, and that they cannot be, he thought. He continued aloud after a second's pause. But a man has to walk before he can run, and they'll need help and oversight for some time on the credit unions and the cooperatives for ginning their cotton, selling it, and buying supplies. It's very important there be no scandals. Festina lente, more haste, less speed. Now, he thought, to sweeten the pill a bit, and it's a good idea anyway. I second your excellent notion of appointing George Washington Carver, who I know, as a special roving representative for the whole program in Dixie. No, Miss Perkins, make that when. We have to tell them something unpleasant rather than continue to bestow a shower of good news. It'll come better from a man of their own race. But while he's a brilliant agricultural scientist, he'll need some competent administrative assistance. Booker T. Washington warned me about that, God rest his soul. I suggest that you ask Mr. Dubois for some names. Tell him I said you needed some keen and first-rate men for the job, young ones, but not too young. Which, he thought, leaves the notably touchy Mr. Dubois owing me a favor. W.E. Dubois was pretty much the party's head of Negro affairs in general since Booker Washington's death, an increasingly important role now that his re-enfranchised people were the party's mainstay in the otherwise hostile Deep South, and had sent Negro congressmen from several Gulf states and a senator from South Carolina to the PRP caucus, the first since Roosevelt's youth during the first Reconstruction. Dubois was a much less agreeable man to the president's way of thinking, but then Washington had been a friend and ally for a long time. Dubois was unquestionably a first-rate man, though, even if prickly. And, he thought, a better man to have inside the tent looking out rather than outside looking, glaring in. And no, he went on, it doesn't matter that your family were friendly with Carver at the University of Iowa, all the better, in fact. He smiled, tilting his face down from the pale expanse of the ceiling to beam at her with a toothy smile. Thank you, Miss Perkins. That will be all for now. I'll review them tomorrow, and you can do up your fair copy for signatures over the next day or two. I know you're looking forward to a dinner with young Lieutenant Di Filippo. She gave him a startled look and a smile. Thank you, Mr. President. She rose and left, first for her own desk by the entrance, where she locked the pad in its secure drawer, but then through the floor into the main quarters. A knock followed. Enter, he said. A man came through, a broad-shouldered but slender soldier in his early 30s with an outdoorsman's weathered tan, close-cropped, sun-faded brown hair, and wide-spaced blue eyes above a short nose and long, thin-lipped mouth. He wore the formal dress uniform of the U.S. Army, a midnight blue that was almost black, with a brigadier general's single star on either side of the standing collar of his tunic. But his uniform was unadorned otherwise, except for the light blue ribbon with a 13-star blazon that bore the Medal of Honor around his neck. The Colt 1911 in the formal holster at his belt was plain and use-worn. He saluted crisply. Mr. President. Roosevelt stood, grunting slightly. He still had a fair bit of muscle in his 64th year and worked at maintaining it, but he'd also put on a fair amount of weight. And now he was paying for the way he'd pushed his body hard every year since his sickly, asthmatic childhood, every strain and tear and broken bone forgotten for 2 or 3 decades coming back to haunt him, like the malaria he'd caught in Cuba. At ease, you young scamp, he said with a grin. The younger man relaxed the ramrod brace. I was a young scamp when Archie and I walked on stilts across the parquet floors in the White House and put your top hats on the stuffed trophy heads, Father, he said. Nowadays, I'm an adult scoundrel who's moved on to real crime. They say the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree, Roosevelt snorted, and came around the desk to embrace his eldest son and namesake. I'm a man lucky in his sons, he thought, feeling the easy strength in the younger man's arms. The lad had finally recovered from the troublesome break a German shell near his tank had inflicted years ago. And lucky in their luck. What greater blessing? Each of his 4 boys had fought for America, in the Mexican intervention for the elder pair, and then all of them in the Great War, and all had been wounded but none killed or crippled. They thought young Quentin was lost for 2 days of breathless fear when his fighting scout went down trailing smoke during a huge furious melee with none other than von Richthofen's flying circus. But then the news had come he'd been found by Allied troops unconscious and very battered but alive in his crashed, shot-up Curtiss Puma behind the American lines in France. And he'd made ace, as the young men called it, before the American Expeditionary Force was withdrawn. You're looking spruce, he said, holding Theodore Jr. at arm's length with his hands on his shoulders for a moment. You'll need to be for the review. Admiral Kuntz is a stickler, but a good progressive. Yes, I remember he was one of the ones pushing for converting the battle cruisers on the slipways to the new airplane carriers. We'll need to work closely together while I'm Governor General of the Philippines and he's CINC of the Pacific Fleet. I'm planning for Case Orange particularly. Their eyes met for a second, and Roosevelt was glad to see sober determination in his son's gaze, as well as eagerness. He knew the young man had political ambitions, and why not? He'd shown he was forceful, could think clearly under the most intense pressure, and was brave to a fault. In fact, reading the citation for that Medal of Honor back in 14 had made his father swear softly as his flesh crept, and his mother burst into tears. Organizing the American Legion for Veterans in 18 had shown he could move men to action in peacetime by his words and force of personality. The job in Manila was a chance to show what he could do as an administrator. If he did well in it, there was no reason he couldn't be president himself someday, perhaps after a stint in a cabinet post, Secretary of State or War, say, or nomination as vice president in 28, and in either case in 32, when the young man was in his prime. And I'll be well past mine, the elder Roosevelt thought. There were the two Adams, father and son presidents, back a century ago, so there is a precedent. And what I've created would be in good hands when I pass the torch. Strong hands, too, ready to carry it forward. My boy has become a very formidable man. You're young for the governor's job, the elder Roosevelt said, but I was young to be president, only 7 years older than you are now. His wife Edith, who was his most valued advisor, as well as his love and other half, came through the door behind her son, looking summery in the semi-formal outfit she'd wear for the review, her graying hair in a coronet beneath the broad-brimmed hat. No newfangled bobs of those absurd bell-shaped cloches for her. With her was John Wilkie, director of the Secret Service and the Black Chamber, anonymous in an ordinary three-piece business suit of cream linen, a snappy Panama in one hand, both appropriate for the southernmost California's endless mild warmth. Well, Theodore, you were right. Once you're used to the heights, this is a very pleasant way to travel. Much less cramped than a railroad, even a private car, Edith said, even with all the people we've got along. It's like being in a flying house, rather like Dorothy, except more decorous than being carried off by a tornado. Roosevelt chuckled. They'd both read from those books to their own grandchildren. I'm glad you think so, my sweet. You look beautiful as always, he added sincerely. And you have rumpled yourself as usual, she said, twitching at his wing collar and the lapels of his cutaway. And you, Ted, are leaving us again just a few years after you came back from the war, and you're taking Eleanor and the grandchildren away with you at this time, to the other side of the world. Mother, Ted Jr. said, we're all going to Manila together on this very airship from San Francisco. 75 miles an hour, 24 hours a day, not counting the stopover in Hawaii, which is only politically necessary, his mother said, blinking thoughtfully. This airship could circumnavigate the world with only 2 stops, he agreed. And it's the presidential air yacht now, like the Mayflower for sea voyages. And we're at peace, and it's not a presidential election year. I suppose I could board in Washington or New York for visits, couldn't I, she said. Leave Washington on Sunday afternoon, arrive in Manila on Thursday, Ted Jr. said. That's more like an express train to the West Coast than a sea voyage, really, Edith said in a musing tone. Faster, her son said, because it can take a straight line, great circle course. Roosevelt had rarely seen his wife nonplussed, but this wasn't the world they'd grown up in together, where steam locomotives and electrical telegraphs were the symbols of the modern. The telephone had been invented when he was a student at Harvard, moving pictures when he was an up-and-coming police commissioner in New York, and the first manned airplane flight when he was already in his first term as president. She thought my going after the nomination in 1912 was a forlorn hope, and looking back without my dander up, she may well have been right, as things were at the start. With Taft as incumbent and the old guard united behind him, it was a long shot, but when his heart gave out in his sleep, we were all flabbergasted when that happened, though he was the size of a beached whale, and his Vice President Sherman already deathly ill. Yes, she saw what that meant as fast as anyone. We're doing the same now. Pardon me.
Absolutely.
Come anytime you've got to